So last week, we learned that Jesus gives us ears to hear and a tongue to speak. But this week, we enter a transitional point in St. Mark's Gospel. The story shifts. If you have a Bible with you, you might notice that the previous passage is Jesus' transfiguration. For our purposes, for this morning, in the transfiguration, Jesus reveals most clearly who he is. He is God's Son who came to fulfill the Old Testament and bring life through his death. From here, we see in our gospel reading an exorcism and a statement about prayer. Why is that? I argue that in light of the transfiguration, Jesus' authority calls for faith. And that's the sentence. Jesus' authority calls for faith. So if nothing else, remember that. But let's get on with the story. Let's place Jesus. Where is he when the crowd approaches him? Well, doesn't quite say, but in verse 14 we know that he had just come down like Moses, from the mountains to his disciples. Moses sees a party with a golden calf. Jesus sees a mess. Either way, there's parallels there. And what does he see? What's the nature of this mess? He sees a big crowd. He sees an argument. There's a demon involved. The Gospels have to be true because real life is very messy, and this is very messy. So what's going on? Well, for those who have read St. Mark's Gospel, it's a familiar scene. Verses 17 and 18 tell us that there's a boy that is possessed. He's very possessed too. The demon left him mute. The boy grinds his teeth, makes him convulse. This demon is very violent. And, as an aside, when we look at evil, we always ask why. But the demonic evil, it's irrational by design. Life is good, rational. But demons, they like that. The devil exists to steal, kill, and destroy. This demon is ruining this boy's life. This boy has no agency in his life. He can't hear anything. He's disconnected from his community. That's just the nature of evil. And this is a demonstration of that. Now, the reason I said it was a familiar scene to us, to those of us that have read Mark's Gospel, is because in Mark 5, verses 1 through 20, and chapter 7, verses 24 through 30, we also see exorcisms. So this is not the first demonic encounter Jesus has. But there's a bit of a twist here. And there's always a twist when you read the scriptures. You're always wanting to pay attention. What's the twist? The man told Jesus, I asked your disciples to cast the spirit out, and they were not able. So the disciples tried their hand at it, didn't work. Jesus' response, I think, might make some of us uncomfortable. O faithless generation, how long am I able to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him to me. But let's be gracious to Jesus. Remember, this isn't Jesus' first rodeo with the demonic. And the disciples would have known of his power, his authority. And the reader, you just saw the transfiguration. Those disciples were not there for the transfiguration. But we were there for the transfiguration because we just read it in the previous passage. So we have to be sympathetic to Jesus as readers. But more than that, Jesus isn't the type of God, because he is God incarnate. He's not the type of God to just go, you've been a bad boy. He's not like that. He still heals. He still gets involved in the mess. Thus, bring him to me. Now, I want to do a small excursus. You might have noticed I used words like heal in death earlier. Well, as I've said in previous sermons, but I'll repeat myself, Death and the demonic are intertwined. The boy is mute like the man last week, but now there is a demon involved. To lose hearing, arguably, is a form of death. Your body's turning against you. And if the devil exists to steal, kill, and destroy, I posit that possession is a type of death. Thus, we can see this exorcism as a type of healing. One could say a type of resurrection, but I think I'm getting ahead of myself. Moving on. Verse 22 has the man begging for healing. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. He sees Jesus' authority. He can sense that Jesus has something special about him. But Jesus challenges the man. If you can, all things are possible for one who believes. The man sees Jesus' authority. Now Jesus is calling for faith. Will the man be like the faithless generation that Jesus condemns, or rather rebukes? Well, we see something interesting here. In verse 23, the man says, I believe, good answer, help my unbelief. Wait a minute. It's not a black and white answer. I say this because I think when we, or at least in my circles, speak of faith, of taking Jesus at his word, one thinks about being excited about Jesus all the time, or never having doubts. You might think of faith as, I never have doubts, I never have questions, I am never scared, I am on board for Jesus at all times and in all places. But that's not quite what the man here says. He says, I don't know, if I could be so bold, I don't know if I believe, but I want it to be true. Help my unbelief. That's good enough for Jesus. Thus, Jesus, having shown he is God's Son in the Transfiguration, the one who will banish death by death, rids the boy of the demon. No, that language is too soft. He commands the demon in verse 25 to leave the boy. You mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again. This was a violent scene because the demon cried out as it left, leaving the boy to convulse and appear dead. The crowd thought it was violent because they said the boy was dead in verse 27. But remember, Jesus came to bring life. So Jesus, showing care, grabbing the boy's hand, one could say as a father to a son, does just that. He gives him life. The boy arose. Now, if you read St. Mark's Gospel, Jesus is always explaining himself to the disciples in private. This is no different. See verse 28. They ask Jesus, why could we not cast it out? Jesus responds, this kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer. Some manuscripts add fasting, Greek manuscripts, but we'll stick with the ESV. It says prayer. As an aside, isn't it interesting that those who were close to Jesus lacked faith, but those that were new to Jesus had faith? God is always surprising us. But anyway, remember what I said earlier. God had shown to Saints Peter, James, and John that Jesus is his Son, who fulfills the Old Testament, whose death would conquer death. This marks a transitional point in St. Mark's Gospel. Jesus is speaking of his death. The cross will now be a shadow over everything Jesus does. The disciples would need to have faith in light of this approaching darkness. And in that sense, it makes sense that St. Mark would have a story of demonic possession right after the Transfiguration. The demonic is darkness, after all. These conflicts would only increase and only get worse from here. But Jesus, being God's man of authority, banished the darkness. He would destroy death after all. But things are going to get harder for the disciples. The leaders will continue to oppose Jesus. They will oppose Jesus so much that they'll murder him. And it is in light of this, all of this in the background, that Jesus tells his words to the disciples. Because if they want to cast out the darkness, if they want to persevere in these dark times that are coming, they need to pray. They need to see that Jesus' authority calls for faith. And what is prayer if not faith in action? Now, church, we live after the cross. So we're not in Mark 9. But like the disciples, we need to see Jesus' authority. We need to see that on the cross, Jesus defeated death and the devil. And that through his Spirit, the Holy Spirit, he gives us resurrection life. We need to see that Jesus is at the right hand of the Father, sovereign over all things. We need to see that one day, Jesus will make creation new and restore all things. And like the disciples, this can be a hard thing. The disciples had to follow somebody who was at odds with the establishment, who, in a society where honor was highly valued, who made them look dishonorable in front of their peers. A man who had so much dishonor that he died a criminal's death. He was crucified. Or rather, maybe today, it's hard to believe in Jesus when things around us look out of control, when our bodies turn against us. Or maybe we think we don't have enough faith. We think that we're not excited enough for Jesus. We think that we're not strong enough to be a Christian. But that's the point of Christianity. Look at the man who said, "I believe, help my unbelief." Was this man's faith perfect? I'd say no. Was his faith strong? No, it wasn't strong. But it's not our faith that needs to be strong. Rather, it is in whom we put our faith in that needs to be strong. Church, we put our faith in the God of the universe who died for us. That's the object of our faith. And if he's the God of the universe, if he's all-powerful, and he died for us, and he's all loving, he will hear you, he'll give you strength for the day, and he'll bring you back from the dead on the last day. He is always with you. So in light of that, we always do communion every Sunday. Let us approach the altar with faith. Jesus' body and blood is here for you. He's still casting out demons. He's still giving life. He still has authority. He still calls for faith. He's not calling for strong faith. He's not calling for perfect faith. He's only calling for faith. See the crucified Christ in the bread and the wine, and feed on him by faith with thanksgiving. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.